3 stories in restaurants. Story 1. This is going to be a long story, so bear with me. To begin with, I must say that I am a 17-year-old girl who is currently working on her first job. For privacy reasons, I will refer to myself by my nickname, Bree. The story could look like a typical restaurant horror story, but because the events of the story lasted a few days, it would technically be a story of harassment. I think the restaurant I work at is called Outback. For those unfamiliar with the restaurant, it is an Australian-themed restaurant. The story took place in December of last year, 2023. Let me describe a little bit the design of my restaurant. As soon as you enter the building, right in front of you is the reception booth. To the left is the waiting section, which has some seating and booths to sit on, and behind the reception booth is the bar section, where there are booths around the bar. To the right of the reception booth is the entrance to the main dining room, partially blocked by a low wall. This means that in the booth right next to the door you cannot see the people who are sitting against the low wall from the reception stand. This will be very important later in the story. The night this happened, I was in charge of closing the reception booth. This means that I was responsible for closing the door after 11 p.m., which is when we close on weekends. My front desk partner had just left about an hour before the situation occurred, so I was the only person at the reception booth for the rest of the night. It was around 10:40 p.m., so it was less than 30 minutes before closing, which means we were really slow. There were only the front of the house staff left to close, and there were only about 4 tables with people, and everyone had already finished their meal. Thus, the waiters were hanging out in the kitchen with the cooks, only occasionally coming back to the front to check on their customers. I myself was starting to get hungry right now, as I had gone straight to work after school and hadn't eaten dinner at all. With no customers coming in at the time, I went to the back and grabbed some bread and a drink, taking them to the reception booth with me. I ate some while browsing my phone until I saw movement. 2 people were entering the building. I turned off my phone right away and stuffed my bread box into a shelf built in the reception booth. When I looked up to greet customers, I could tell right away that something was wrong. To begin with, one of them was wearing a balaclava. For those who don't know what it is, it's a type of face covering that only allows the person's eyes to be seen. In other words, he couldn't see this man's face. The other only had a headscarf. They were both wearing rather bulky jackets, but even underneath them, I could see their nervous movements. The shorter of the 2 came up to me and said something. I asked him to repeat because his voice was cracking. I assumed they were probably drugged or drunk because of their body language and the smell of cigarettes they had. After repeating himself a couple of times, I finally understood what he was saying. I was ordering takeout. Now, we have a specific takeout room located towards the back of the restaurant, right next to the kitchen entrance. I gave them my typical customer service smile and started telling them to go over there, but the one who spoke to me interrupted me. He asked me for a couple of menus so they could see the menu at that time. This wasn't an uncommon request, so I gave it to them without much thought, assuming they'd take them with them to the takeout room. What I didn't expect was that they would sit right there, next to the reception booth to see the menu. While this wasn't a big deal, how they chose to sit was sending red flags in my head. One chose to sit in the seats right next to the reception booth, and the other chose to sit in the empty booth right next to the door, i.e. the seats closest to my booth. Call me paranoid, but I'm a young woman who's had a lot of bad encounters in the past, so yes, this was giving me a bad feeling. They stood there for a while without speaking. Every time a customer got up and left, I noticed how the tallest, quietest one would get up and look around the dining room and then sit back down, almost as if he was examining who was left. He literally did this every time someone left and seemed to be getting more and more agitated with each passing minute. I considered going find a manager, but since these men had technically done nothing wrong, I didn't know what I could say to the manager. Trying to distract myself from the uncomfortable feeling, I decided to fold some children's menus. Unfortunately, my bread box was in the way of menus, so I had to put it aside. I guess the men heard the styrofoam box move because the one who had spoken to me earlier looked up and just smiled. It wasn't a good smile. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it made my stomach contract just by looking at it. He asked me if the food here was good. I was a little transfixed at the question, like you're here to ask for food. Shouldn't you know? I just forced a smile and said yes. He looked at me silently after that, so I looked away and did my best to ignore him. This lasted only 2 minutes before he spoke again. Again, I couldn't figure it out, so I asked him to repeat. I still couldn't hear him, so I stupidly took a step around my stall to get a little closer to hear him. "Do you have Instagram?" was what he asked me. I went blank. This is the part where I should have lied and said no, but without thinking I automatically gave my normal answer for when this question is asked. "Yes, but I'm only 17, sir," to which he replied, "Oh, okay, I'm only 19 too." While I don't judge people who exchange social media with older people, I have a personal rule for me to never give social media to anyone outside of my school age. Being still a student myself, I find that it's much easier to avoid bullies that way. But unfortunately for me, I'm also a pretty non-confrontational person, so I didn't want to just say no or say no directly. I really should have. So I reluctantly gave him a thin smile and then said, "Oh, well, I have a boyfriend," which was not really a lie. Normally, if my answer about my age doesn't turn men off, my answer about my boyfriend does. So it was to my discomfort when all he did was raise an eyebrow and then reply, "Well, it's not like he's asking for your number, it's just an Instagram." Yes, as if the app specifically designed to post photos and stories is much better than a phone number. I felt like a deer in the headlights. This is where I made the main mistake that I still reproach myself for to this day. I reluctantly opened my Instagram and handed him my phone. I still don't know why I did it. The one thing I'm grateful for to this day is that I never post or save stories. So all the information I could get from my Instagram was from my profile picture and my lists of followers and followers. I saw him type in his account and press follow on my phone, and then he gave it back to me. I then quickly returned to my post to avoid further conversation. I was feeling quite uncomfortable now. As for the last few minutes, every time someone got up to leave, the quiet man would get up and look around and then sit back down, looking more and more agitated each time. After a few minutes of awkward silence, I felt a tap on my shoulder, which made me spin. Behind me was the closing waitress, whom, for the sake of this story, I will call Juana. Juana is one of my friends from school who I met during sophomore year, and I actually helped her apply to work at the restaurant. I immediately felt a little calmer about his presence. We talked quietly for a couple of minutes until he mentioned that one of his former bartenders who had left the job earlier had come back to visit for a few minutes and was in the kitchen. I was thrilled to hear this, as he and I had a pretty good friendship during his time working at the restaurant. So, making sure no one else was coming in, I walked quickly to the kitchen to visit him for a minute. After giving him a hug and talking for a couple of minutes, I went back to my reception desk. As I passed by the bar, I saw Juana being called by the last people who were sitting at the bar, an older couple. I saw the woman point at me and mentally rolled my eyes, thinking she was probably complaining about me leaving my duties at the reception desk. I didn't pay attention to it and just went back to my place. I wasn't even there for a minute before I suddenly felt someone grab my shoulder. Surprised, I turned to see Juana standing behind me, her face ashen. I was immediately alarmed and tried to ask her what was wrong. But she just shook her head and then motioned for me to follow her, which I did. We walked to the bar and then she leaned over to whisper in my ear, "Don't drink or eat anything up there." The woman at the bar saw that the man with the handkerchief was handling your drink while you were in the kitchen. I felt my blood run cold when I heard this. I should have stood there, staring blankly at her, because then she added, "The man was about to take your bread box when he looked up and saw her looking at him." She said she just smiled at him and sat down again, At this point, I could feel my hands trembling slightly. I knew something was seriously wrong with those men, but I never expected them to tamper with my food as I walked away for just a couple of minutes. I don't know why I didn't go find a manager at the time. I don't know what I was thinking, but I just gave Juana a nod and then thanked her before returning to my post. I stood there for a few minutes in silence, feeling my heart beat in my chest as I avoided eye contact with either man. I did not touch the food or drink. Shortly after 10:55 p.m., the last table he ate paid his bill and left, causing the quiet man to get up and look around again. The only people left were the older couple at the bar. I guess the man lost his patience because then he said something I couldn't understand, got up and walked out the front door, banging on it behind him. And I mean, he hit her. I didn't even know that the door could be so loud when it closed. I stood there in silence, stunned, before I heard the bartender call to the bar. I'll call him Dante for the story. He's a tall man in his 50s with a son just a couple of years younger than me. He called me, smiling humorously as he wondered if some guy had gone out in a rage. I took this as an opportunity to quickly walk to the bar. I leaned over to him and told him the situation. 2 guys are up there and they won't leave. One of them harassed me to give him my Instagram, and the woman at the bar says she saw him manipulating my drink. All the joy disappeared from his face when he heard this, now taking on a much more serious expression with an authoritative voice. He headed out of the bar and called the security manager and one of the bartenders into the kitchen. There was a small group of employees who had finished their shift for the evening, relaxing in some of the booths and in the closing section near the kitchen, and the manager told me to stay there with them. From there, I watched as the 3 men approached the lone man in front. They didn't even reach him before he quickly got up and left. I guess seeing them intimidated him into leaving. After he left, my manager came back to me and took the keys from my hand to lock the door, telling me to leave for the night. Feeling upset, I did exactly what she said. I went to thank the older couple before I left that night and found out that the reason they had stayed so late was because the men had also given them a bad feeling and were watching me. It turns out that the older gentleman turned out to be a retired policeman, so he gave me a serious talk about safety with strangers. I really wished that was the conclusion of the story, but unfortunately it wasn't. That same night, I logged into my Instagram and proceeded to block the guy, thinking the situation was over. The next morning, however, I woke up to a follow-up request from a newly created account. I didn't recognize the man in the profile picture, but after looking at his posts, I noticed something suspicious. His 3 posts coincided exactly with the time he had requested to follow me, and he had also followed a couple of my friends from my old school. I messaged both of them asking if they knew him, but they both denied it, stating that he had asked them both to follow them both around the same time he had asked me to follow me. I took screenshots of his account and his posts and then ignored him for a few hours. I figured this might be the account of the man who wore the balaclava that night. I later checked the account again to block him and found that he had deleted his profile picture, all his posts, and even emptied his list of followers and followers. I blocked it and went about my day. Everything was quiet until the following weekend. I was the second to last to go out that night when I marked my departure. I went to the front to talk to my coworker. Turned out that I was going to take Juana home that night, so I had to wait about 30 minutes for her to come out so we could leave. When I arrived at the reception booth, I began to talk to my fellow front desk until something caught my attention. Remember how I mentioned that it can be hard to see someone sitting in the booth right next to the door because of the low wall? Yes, well, that's why I was surprised to see some shoes peeking out of the cabin. I looked around the corner for a second and immediately felt my blood run cold. Sitting there was a man wearing a bulky jacket and a balaclava. Turning to my coworker, I asked her if she knew who she was. She looked at me in confusion and said that it was probably one of the kitchen workers waiting for her transport. I doubted that, but before I could investigate further, Juana came out and I quickly told her what I saw. She seemed just as confused as my coworker, but together we headed to the booth. Just as we were about to reach the cabin, the man got up and left, passing through the main entrance. We couldn't see much beyond his clothes, as his hood was pulled down over his eyes, but I recognized his bulky jacket. After she left, we went back to our previous conversation until it was time for Juana and I to go out together. As we drove away from the restaurant, I couldn't help but feel like we were being followed. I don't know if it was just paranoia or if we were really being followed, but I was so glad I asked Juana to join me that night, and so the story ends. I haven't seen or heard anything more from the men after that, but every time I walk into the restaurant and see a bulky jacket in the booth right next to the door, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine. Story 2. When I was 18 and had just broken up with my much older boyfriend, I basically went crazy dating guys. At that time, I was also dressed very gothic. I even got to wear a royal corset and a long coat, mainly enjoying the attention. One particular afternoon, my friend and roommate at the time, we decided to eat at a local Japanese restaurant, both dressed in eye-catching fashion. Our waiter was a slim, mediocre white guy who was clearly a bit of an alternative, but it was hard to really tell with the uniform. We joked about leaving my phone number on the receipt or something, so I went for it. Later that night, he texted me and we talked for a few days, never really finding the right time to meet as he worked 40 minutes away from where he lived. He mentioned that the boots he was wearing meant a lot to him and some other weird things that just seemed like outlandish jokes. One night, very late, when I was coming home and I was texting and driving like any other 18-year-old, we decided to meet. I invited him to my apartment, where only my roommate and I were, since our other two roommates hadn't arrived yet. It was fine at first because I was already drunk, so I just let him vent about whatever he wanted. He just kept talking about his life, going to jail, medical bills, his parents, and more. Eventually he asked me if I wanted to see his tattoos, and I just said, sure, why not? He lifted his shirt and I could not only see the gun hidden in his belt, but also that he had multiple poorly covered Nazi tattoos. One was barely covered with a banana. I don't know what happened, but I just decided that the best way to deal with the situation was to appease him, so I moved on. I don't remember exactly all the details because it was over 2 years ago and I was drunk, but he ended up pulling out his gun and putting it to my head, asking me if I was scared. I was immensely confused and tried to challenge him by saying that I wasn't, which made me keep it for a while. When we were going to have sex in my messy room, he pulled out his gun again, saying he wanted to do it with her outside. I got really angry and tried to fight him to get her off his back and out of my head. Of course, I wasn't as strong as him and he hit me on the arm with it, which really hurt because I was a pretty. When I finally managed to pull him away from me and he realized I was angry and not scared, he started acting like an addict, saying I was crazy for not caring about him pulling out a gun. He ran, jumped the fence of the apartment complex, and didn't even take his car in which he had arrived. The next morning, his car was gone, and he had a big bruise where he had hit me. For me, it's a funny story, but now I realize how badly it could have ended. So to the crazy waiter at the Japanese restaurant, I don't think I'd want to see you again. Story 3. This incident occurred during my sophomore year of college, sometime in the fall of 2002. During the 4 years I was there, I worked as a waitress at a small family restaurant next to campus. The payment was far from adequate, but the owners treated me like one of them. Growing up without parents made this connection very important to me. So much so that they are still an important part of my life to this day. We were 4 girls working nights, and 3 of us were students attending college. The surrounding neighborhood had been in decline for the past 20 years, and despite the large number of students who inhabited the area, crime continued to rise steadily. To at least try to prevent us from becoming victims of such a crime, several security measures were put in place. All the usual things, such as accompanying each other to our cars, not leaving the back door open, things like that. However, no matter how hard you try to stay safe, Some idiot will find a way to rape you anyway. One night, just as we were finishing our dinner shift, an idiot giant did just that, and in the process nearly caused a beautiful family to collapse. That night, we were quickly coming to the end of another regular dinner shift when a man came in and said he wanted to take something to go. No problem, I took his order and passed it to the kitchen. That night, Matthias, the only son of the owners, was working in the kitchen, and he was not happy when he saw him. She tried to get it ready as quickly as possible so she could finish cleaning and go home. While waiting, the man walked nervously, looking outside repeatedly. This behavior seemed a bit suspicious, so I put aside my closing tasks and started looking outside to see what I was seeing. It took me a minute, but I saw another man standing just out of sight of the bay windows. This guy was dirty. His hair looked like it hadn't been washed or combed in years. The actions of the second man were very similar to those of the first, almost as if they were about to rob us. Foolishly, I put aside my instincts and began to collect the man's orders. When I gave him the total, he quickly handed me a 500 peso bill and looked behind it. I continued to ignore his behavior, and when I opened the drawer, I heard a man's voice quietly telling me to give him all the money in the cash register. Perhaps by instinct, I looked up to see who it was. Everything was coming from the customer, and he was pointing a gun in my face. "Keep your voice low and don't panic. Just give me the money and drop everything." All this time I had been the only employee at the front of the place, so he had me at his mercy. Every word he said trembled as it came out of his mouth, his fear making mine even worse. I didn't need him to tell me twice. I grabbed every penny from the drawer and was about to give it to him when I heard Matthias' voice coming from behind me. "Did you forget something?" Everything that happened after this happened so quickly that I still question my memory of the events to this day. I know for a fact that Matthias' arrival surprised us both, but the expression on the customer's or thief's face was one of pure surprise. The moment I noticed him pull the gun away from my face, I crouched behind the podium to hide. The shooting began shortly after that. She wasn't sure if Matthias had been hit at that point. I was still curled up on the floor with my arms over my head, much like a child hiding under the covers and waiting for the bogeyman to leave. I don't know how long I was like this, a few seconds perhaps. When I finally dared to look into my arms, all I saw was Matthias' body lying motionless on the ground. Even then, I stayed where I was until I heard her mom's voice screaming at us. That's when I finally stood up to see the results. The shooter was gone, and the money was scattered all over the floor from where I dropped it. Matthias probably died immediately at his feet, and grilled chicken salad was scattered everywhere, along with the money. Matthias' mother ran out of the back room when she saw her only son lying on the ground. She collapsed in pain next to him and stayed there until the police arrived. Just so as not to drag out an already long story, I'll leave you with the facts. Even after telling the police everything and giving a detailed description of both men, neither was caught. The family closed the restaurant for several days after the shooting, and it remained that way until a few days after the funeral. Since the day it reopened, a plainclothes police officer has been guarding the place, and there has never been another assault since. My work at the restaurant would continue for the rest of my time in college. She was very affected for a while and could have been for much more if it weren't for the love and support of family. It seemed like we served as a coping mechanism for each other, and through the shared grief over Matthias' death, we became more united. After graduating, I moved on and currently live in Atlanta with my partner. The restaurant continues to operate 5 days a week and is doing well. It looks like the neighborhood may be on its way up. In the past year, several large companies have opened branches, and continued growth has proven to be a positive for everyone involved. Allison, the matriarch of the family, recently told me in a phone call that she was willing to put up with the hipsters slowly invading the area. After all, they were a great advance over the murderous attics seen there before.